As we mentioned earlier, communities across the West have been plagued by side effects of unhealthy watersheds. To illustrate what those impacts look like, we've pulled together a dynamic panel of experts to share their experiences with you. Now, this panel is sponsored by our friends at the Business for Water Stewardship. Let's give those guys a round of applause really quick. Thank you very much for sponsoring. That'll give time for my friend to make her way up here, because to moderate today and introduce our list of panelists is the Colorado River Basin Director for Business for Water, and that is my friend Molly Mugglestone. And Molly, I had to learn this the hard way. The stairs were on the other side of the steps, the other side of the stage. So, but Molly, thank you very much. Thanks. And I'm going to let you have the mic.
I might have come up too fast. Sorry. Good to see you. Hi, everybody. I see lots of friends, but I just drove in from Gunnison, so haven't been able to say hi yet. But we're really happy to help sponsor this conference at Business for Water Stewardship. We work on bringing businesses into the conversation on water. I've been doing that work for about 10 years, and we're a partner or a project of the Bonneville Environmental Foundation. And my colleague Sarah is going to speak to corporate partnerships and corporate funding for water and restoration projects tomorrow. So today, though, I am here to moderate this next panel. So I think what I'm going to do first is just give you guys some quick introductions to our three panelists, and then Paula, if you want to come on up to, yeah, come join me. Paula is our one panelist that's in the room, and then we have two that are joining us over Zoom. So I'm just going to do real quick descriptions. Yeah, go ahead and sit down. That'd be great. Of all of our panelists. So we'll start with Chris Carlton. Chris has been the Plumas National Forest Supervisor since 2019, previously serving the Bureau of Land Management, Nevada, where he was the field manager for the Caliente Field Office for just over 4 years. Chris was the agency administrator for Plumas National Forest for the East Zone of the Dixie, which included the Plumas National Forest and communities within it. Chris is going to give remarks on his recent experience with the Dixie Fire and other recent Type 1 fires. Next, we'll have Karl Morgenstern. Karl is currently the Watershed Restoration Program Manager for the Eugene Water and Electric Board in Oregon, leading the response and recovery efforts to the devastation of the 2020 Holiday Farm Fire on the Mackenzie Watershed. In 2000, Eugene, Oregon was one of the first larger metropolitan areas to take its watershed as part of its water infrastructure and to recognize the importance of interconnectedness. Karl spearheaded the effort, building trust and the relationships needed to complete large-scale floodplain restoration projects before disaster strikes. So we'll kind of hear sort of from both of different angles of when these large events happen and how communities are responding. And then Paula Stepp is the Executive Director of the Middle Colorado Watershed Council, where she focuses on facilitating water-related projects and to work collaboratively on fire restoration efforts. In 2020, more than 171,400 acres burned during the Grizzly Creek and Pine Gulch fires in Garfield County, threatening the community's water supply and transportation routes. So I'm really excited to have all of these various perspectives as we dig deeper into some of these issues and how they affect our communities. So we'll go ahead and welcome Chris on our very large screen. Hi, Chris.
Hey, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for the invitation and the opportunity to talk a little bit about what's going on. This is a really timely topic. So yeah, I'm Chris Carlton. I'm the forest supervisor here in the Plumas National Forest, and I have a little connection to the Front Range. I spent about 4.5 years working with the BLM in Cheyenne, Wyoming, and the Front Range was a pretty regular weekend getaway along with some of the mountain areas across Colorado. So as mentioned, came here to the Plumas National Forest and the Forest Service in 2019. And it's been a pretty busy couple of years. And for those, I'll give a little bit of context around this forest. We're around 1.2 million acre forest, and we cross the Sierras, Central Sierra area. We do provide not only a lot of water, but a lot of hydropower. We have just a long history of being a really strong timber watershed and wildlife forest. We have a lot of recreation and pretty much whatever the agency helps administer, we have here on the forest. So we really are a diverse forest. And so in 2019, we had the first fire, well, in 2018, we had the Camp Fire, which I think we're all familiar with. In 2019, we had the next fire of national significance on this forest, which was the Walker Fire. And that was about 56,000 acres. And at the time, that was a really big fire. That was oh my gosh, what are we going to do to move forward from that? The next season, we had the North Complex Fire. and that's, we throw the word unprecedented around. And I think between COVID and fires, we've probably gotten so that we can probably never hear that word again and be perfectly happy. However, we really did have some extreme fire behavior, and we ended up with a single day run of around 30 miles that led to a 320,000 acre fire. And that had really devastating effects on a number of communities, including the loss of life of some folks in those communities. Fast forward to 2021, and we had, I know the moderator mentioned the Dixie, but I'm going to start with the Beckworth. We had the first fire of the season was the Beckworth Complex, which was also a type 1 fire. And that one began the end of June, extremely dry, kind of unseasonably dry conditions that I think a lot of us are familiar with. And from the beginning, we were seeing, I mean, we had that fire and there was rain out there. Within a couple of days, it didn't matter. It was up and going, and we were seeing extreme fire behavior. That a lot of firefighters were pretty well, it was pretty well off the charts. And so we saw that and the devastation, and that ended up impacting a community named Doyle along the eastern escarpment along 395 on the east side of the Sierras. As that fire was getting under control, we had the beginning of the Dixie, and I think we've all seen what happened there. So it's been a lot of nonstop high impact fires across, and I say the forest because that's where I work, but the reality is it's across our communities. It's across the landscape, and it's regardless of whose property line we're on, right? Fire doesn't care, and the impacts don't care. And so I'm just going to give a couple of quick highlights here. The Dixie, 963,000 acres, 404,000 of that on the Plumas, 61% high severity, 1,000 miles of roads within that footprint, 16 developed rec sites, a little under 18,000 acres of wilderness, 200,000 acres of rangelands, over 700 residences destroyed. The Beckworth, 108,000 acres, and the North Complex, 319,000 acres. And when you add all of that up, it feels and is extremely overwhelming. So the challenge is, what do we do? And I want to talk a little bit about, so that's what happened. What are the impacts? The impacts are we tend to think in terms of the landscape, especially as land managers. But as we start seeing impacts within our wildland urban interface, and we start seeing the level of impacts on our communities, it really hits home that there are a lot of intangible impacts of fires of this magnitude. As rural communities, we are highly dependent on and tied to our natural resources. That's what built these communities from the beginning, whether it was timber, mining, grazing. And so that tie remains, even as we've progressed, there are a lot of people who don't have jobs that directly tie to it, but indirectly, that's still the lifeblood of our communities. And when we have impacts, it really affects all of us. And so from those impacts, how do you recover? How do you move on from something like that? And it's not really from, it's with, right? Because those impacts are with us for a long, long time. And so here on the Plumas, we took a couple of courses of action. First one is we've got some unburned communities. We need to protect those communities that remain and that have not been impacted by fire. As we face what may be another pretty intense fire season, we absolutely need to be out in front and recalibrating what community protection and risk reduction really looks like. When we're seeing fire behavior like what we've seen, our responses and our planning can't be the same. And so that's step one. Priority project is that we're underway on is how do we protect those communities and reduce risk in a meaningful way. And you will hear me not use the acronym or the term WUI to describe the project, because what we need to do is reduce the risk and the threat to the communities. That may be working in the WUI, it may be working miles out. It may be taking strategic approaches in a lot of different ways. We can't just keep focused on one piece of it. So we're looking at how we protect what has not been impacted. The second priority project and effort that we have is how do we recover? And if I can share my screen, I think I have the ability to do that. Is that correct? Let's see. Okay. So is that successfully sharing? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Sorry. So on that map, you'll see some blobs with a couple of different colors. And what we did is we took a look at where are our highest areas of risk. Where are the biggest threats to communities right now? It's basically kind of that fireshed approach on maybe a little bit of a more localized perspective. Purple is the stuff that is absolutely critical, essential, high risk. Red, very high risk. Red is high risk. Green are areas that have not been impacted. Yellow are areas that are within fire footprints. The dark shading you see on there is fire footprints from those past three major fires. As you can see, a lot of the forest has been severely affected. So I wanted to share that just to give a little bit of perspective of both the magnitude and the context of what we're talking about here. So we know that recovery means a lot of things. And I could ask, I don't know how many people are in the room there. I apologize, I can't be there in person, but we could ask everyone in the room, and I guarantee we'll get about 20 more responses than numbers of people in the room if we ask, what does recovery look like? So going back to some of the comments we heard from Deputy Chief Deputy Chief French and from the regional forester, it's about partnerships and collaboration. We don't have the answers. And so for our recovery, we're starting to sit around the table with all of our partners and ask that question. What does recovery look like? If we ask you, what are your top 3 things that matter to you? Because it's not just about treating the landscape. It's about providing opportunities for social, economic recovery, providing opportunities to get jobs back in there. Are there opportunities for new industries to come in? We've got a lot of burned landscape out there. How are we going to make that? How are we going to move forward with that in a way that's going to be positive and help take us all forward? And so we've got a couple of initiatives. One of them is working with a bunch of partners, and we're not asking we're not coming up with a proposed action and saying, here's the Forest Service plan. How do you guys like it? We're starting from what is our collective plan around the table. We really need to be present as equal partners with everybody there. And we got to figure this out together. So that's part of it, and we've heard about the funding and the resources that are coming our way, which is phenomenal. We're going to need to augment our capacity. And sure, we can hire, and I think everybody's familiar with some of the challenges that hiring poses these days. So we will be successful in hiring but it may take a little bit of time. And we also need to look at how we get stuff done while we go through that. And so we're working, like I said, with the partners, and part of what we're looking at is how do we build interdisciplinary team capacity? How do we get through the NEPA process we all have to go through? How do we do all that in a complementary way? And so that's, like I say, we're at the pretty beginning stages right now. We do know we need to be aggressive around it. Our community protection project, we've set a 1-year deadline. So we want to be able to start implementing next season on that. So that means we've got about a year to get through NEPA for a pretty ambitious fuels reduction project. So talking, I guess, a little bit about those, we have the resources, we have a phenomenal list of partners, and a lot of will, and we're going to continue moving forward there, but there do remain some challenges. A couple of them are our systems are not really designed to handle the magnitude and scale of impacts. We look at things like burned area emergency rehab, suppression repair. How do we treat those immediate need hazard trees, for example? How do we make our forests and public lands safe for people to come to? All of that are some of those logistical challenges that we're facing right now, and trying to navigate at a pace and scale that's really never been done before. So I want to leave enough time for questions, because I want to make sure I capture what's important to the audience there. But just overall, it's the impacts across the watersheds and across the communities are huge. So are the opportunities, and so are the resources available to us right now. And as we talk about pretty regularly, there is no playbook for this. There is no script. We are in uncharted waters, to use the pun. So it's really going to be whatever we choose to make of it. So thank you for the time and the opportunity, and look forward to any questions or conversation.
Great, thanks, Chris. I think we will go to Karl next, and we'll save questions for the end. So if you have questions, write them down for Chris. And Karl, we can see you.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here. I wish I was there in person. I really wanted to be there, partly because I wanted to go see my daughter who lives near there, but it didn't work out. So what I'm going to do today is talk about something that I think you guys have already started talking about, and just the value of collaboration and being able to work together before you have to deal with emergency that helps you address an emergency efficiently and effectively after the fact. And just so I'm going to go through some slides fairly quickly, just to give you some context and some background before I start talking about the Holiday Farm fire and what we're doing about that and our response to that. And I assume you can see what I'm showing. I'm pretty sure you can, I hope.
Yeah, we can see it. Yep.
Okay. So this is the Mackenzie River watershed in Oregon. It's the sole source of drinking water for Eugene. And so you can see basically it's we have an urban area at the lower part of the watershed. And then some of the things I want to point out is, it starts at the upper part is, over 10,000 feet, and it ends at 400 feet. So fairly big vertical drop from top to bottom. The other part I want to point out is that we have precipitation that probably you guys would love to have, from 40 inches of rain down in Eugene to 110 inches up in the mountains, which usually is snowpack. We have glaciers in the Three Sisters area. But the last thing I want to point out on this map is that flat area on the right side of the watershed is basically a big, large, what we call sponge. This is very young basalt. These are all volcanoes that erupted. The most recent one being about 3,000 years ago. And so you can see the picture below that these are basically look today just like big lava fields, boulder fields. So if you can imagine 110 inches of snow sitting on top of that, and when it melts, it comes out in these huge springs. And so Oregon State University studied this and dated this. And basically they found about, on average, about 6 to 7 years from snow melt to water showing up in these huge springs. And so we recognized, EWEB recognized back in 2000 that protecting this critical water resource is paramount to the 200,000 people that we serve. And so we started a source protection program and really tried to model it off New York City's Catskills program. They had the Cadillac, we built the Pinto version of that. And so basically the idea is to be able to measure the balance between what's happening in the watershed as far as its health and what's happening with humans and the use of that watershed, and then trying to implement actions that help basically balance that so we can maintain the exceptional water that we get from this watershed. And so to give you a sense of kind of how this is laid out, the Forest Service owns 68% of it and manages it. 25% is wilderness. And then you see that light pink, purple is industrial timberland. And then that dark purple, and then you have BLM scattered in there. And then that dark purple is really a mix of small woodlots, agriculture, communities, kind of that everything else. And then you have the urban areas down below, and our intake is basically below at the bottom of the watershed. So the main threats when we were before the fire, we were trying to deal with is really development and this human built environment. Development, people love this river. It's a world-class fly fishing, salmon, steelhead, Chinook salmon. And so people love it so much that they want to build right on it. And so the big threat we had was development pressures in the watershed. And so the program we built starting in 2001 really had these kind of four main pillars of water quality, emergency response, urban runoff, where we're putting in wetlands and green infrastructure to try to treat that. And then the big one was this riparian forest restoration and protection program. And so the Pure Water Partners program, which we piloted with over a dozen landowners in 2014 and officially launched in 2018, includes basically 9 key partners that you see below, including the University of Oregon and the Freshwater Trust, which aren't on there. But really the purpose of this program was to protect those riparian and floodplain forests that were healthy. We saw the idea, the concept that it's easier or cheaper and more efficient to protect healthy stuff than to try to restore degraded. And so the idea was, let's protect the best and then restore the rest. And so to do that, we built this complex program, which I'm just showing you this as the infrastructure we built. So you have the partners, and basically the idea was to align multiple different sources of funding that then goes out to these implementers, the watershed councils, the soil water conservation districts, the trusts that do these actions that then allow for the outcomes of maintaining high water quality, protecting cold water habitat, and improving ecosystem function in the watershed, as well as kind of the whole public information and education side of things. So I'm not going to go into any of this, but just to understand that before the fire hit, we had this infrastructure in place, and we were basically working with about 90 landowners in that program. And then the Holiday Farm fire hit us on Labor Day in 2020. And this was one of 5 huge fires that hit Oregon at the exact same time. And so across Oregon, there's millions of acres burned, thousands and thousands of homes destroyed. So we were one of 5 major disasters in Oregon that we were that Oregon and everybody was trying to deal with at the same time. The Holiday Farm fire burned 173,000 acres in 3 days. It was a 70-mile-an-hour east wind, unprecedented. This is West Slope, Cascade, wet forest that burned incredibly quickly. We are in a drought, seems like everybody else in the West, and destroyed over 430 homes. And so what we ended up doing is Lane County Emergency Operations asked us if we basically EWEB, the utility, could run the Watershed Recovery Task Force as part of the emergency operations. There's 4 task force, and so I was the task force lead, and we're still working in this structure. But as you can see, we basically built up the structure for the task force from day one, where we had incident response as things started coming unraveling in the fire. So you can see that in our source protection program, the Watershed Emergency Response System we built basically, became the incident response team. The water quality team that we had in the real-time monitoring stations we had in the watershed for basically monitoring for harmful algal blooms and cyanotoxins became our early warning system to turbidity events and other things. And then the restoration team and the landowner program team was basically the Pure Water Partners. So you can see how these teams basically just were built off of existing source protection programs that were in place before the fire. So this shows you the fire footprint, and then also the Pure Water Partners. This is the boundary that program worked. And so you see that, obviously we had 90 landowners in the program before the fire, of which 35 were impacted by the fire. And I just mentioned that because one of the things you see that, well, I'll talk about in the next slide, but one of the things is really critical is your relationship and trust that you have built with landowners. And so what we ended up doing was reorienting the Pure Water Partners program to basically, instead of doing riparian assessments, to look at forest health and decide whether a landowner should get payments for protecting a healthy forest or restoration. We pivoted that to do basically burn assessments after the fire, and then install and design erosion control measures. And so we basically just pivoted this to post-fire response. So while the fire was burning, basically we organized ourselves and started working with other folks to get these systems pivoted to this new purpose that we were marching down. But the one thing that was incredibly critical for this is that our board approved $1 million while the fire was burning to basically take on this task force role and start doing this work. And so, so the first thing we did was, we identified 150 homes that burned right on the river. And so we started trying to stabilize those structures so that that toxic ash and debris wouldn't flow into the river ahead of the winter storms. And the one thing that is kind of interesting is that, so we used, GIS, we're using GIS for our riparian forest assessments to start doing burn assessments and kind of line out this work. And one of the things that's interesting is, so EPA came in to address the toxic debris from the burned homes, but they're basically 3-4 months out. I mean, there's 4 major fires, and we were in the list of those. So they were going from one fire to another. And so we were basically able to stabilize a lot of this stuff and then just hand that work off to EPA as soon as they showed up. So it worked really nicely. But that critical piece is having the money to actually do this work right after the fire. And we're able to create a dashboard so that we could track the work and be able to document it. The interesting thing is that when we went to seek reimbursement from FEMA for this work, they basically said, well, no, you're not eligible for this because you don't have the authority to do this work. And so we never thought of that. But anyway, we worked that out, and it all worked out in the end. So while the emergency response phase was going, and we're trying to address the most critical erosion and debris issues, we built this approach as far as a post-fire holiday farm fire restoration plan. It really came into 3 big buckets of work. The risk base, which I was just kind of talking about, the waste, debris, erosion issue, knowing that invasive species are going to follow, and rebuilding. And then the resiliency piece is really those large scale restoration projects that help us address kind of as the landscape comes unraveled post-fire, helps us mitigate for that. And then the strategic is really that longer term look of trying to do landscape scale carbon sequestration projects over thousands of acres that also provide watershed health benefits. So real quickly, the kind of the risk-based actions. So we transitioned from May after the emergency response phase into this phase. So we retooled our GIS field mapping tools to really look at doing these full property assessments that looked at fuels issues, invasive weed problems, erosion, and then the re-veg problems. And we're still implementing that. In fact, this slide's a little out of date. Apologize about that, but we've done a lot more properties than what's pointed out here. But the idea is that each property that we do an assessment on, we map these units, and then our contractors follow behind and do the work. And so right now we're actually just, as of this week, finishing this, getting 500,000 native shrubs and trees in the riparian and floodplain areas as kind of an initial kind of revegetate these critical areas as the upland areas are kind of being addressed down the road. So we're just finishing this work as I speak. So the floodplain restoration projects are these large scale. This is an example of South Fork Mackenzie. And so these were the partnership, the Forest Service, Mackenzie Watershed Council started these in 2016 with the South Fork being the first one. So you can see that pre-project on the upper left. It's an incised large tributary to the Mackenzie. And basically because of forest roads and levees, the river got channelized over time. So the idea is that you basically take this and reset it. It's a stage 0 restoration project. So the idea is you remove those old road features and berms. They literally take that material and put it into the river channel. You divert the river during this project and fill the river channel back up to a target elevation that reconnects it with its floodplain during base flow. And then you put a lot of large wood roughness on the floodplain, and then reintroduce the river onto the new floodplain and let it figure out where it's going to go. Now this area got burned in the Holiday Farm fire, and this became basically a huge fire break. Wildlife took refuge here in the face of the fire. And so it became really a tool that we then started looking at increasing across the landscape. And so this is kind of a crude map, but it shows you basically the fire footprint, and then those oblong is where we're doing floodplain restoration. The red ones are ones that are in motion or have been completed. Black ones are where we're going next. And those little eyelash things are really these, I don't know if you can see that picture on the bottom there, these large wood projects in the tributaries where we don't have these large floodplains to work, is taking some of these dead and dying hazard trees and putting them into large wood complexes that really slow down flow in these tributaries and drop out sediment. And so basically, if we implement, and we're on schedule to implement all this work by 2023, then we'll have essentially pre-treated 70% of the burn landscape before it hits the river. So the idea is that we know the landscape's going to come unraveled, and we can't replant this whole landscape, but put projects on the ground that help mitigate the impacts of that. So this is one project. This shows, this is the Mackenzie on the right. There's a number of severely burned watersheds on the left that you can't see coming off of Mount Hagen that enter this project. But you can see the Mackenzie's an incised river. And then there's on the left, there's an incised creek. And so basically what we ended up doing is basically resetting this whole thing so that it slows down flow, drops out sediment, and really helps buffer the impacts of the fire. So this is the kind of the map of where we're going. And we're basically going to FEMA to help fund this, but Quartz Creek is the one down there on the lower left. This was a severely burned creek basin, about 45 square miles. And this is kind of the design that we're marching towards to build. So this is the model of our restoration design. So you see on the left, this is during spring, modeled during spring melt. You can see it's just a fire hose coming down there. So as we have debris flows and so forth, the sediment and organics and metals and nutrients are just going to be flushed into the river. On the right is post-restoration that we'll be doing next year. And this is you can just see how the velocities just drop out, provide us the ability to drop out sediment and buffer the impacts of the landscape, burned landscape. And basically how we're paying for all this work, our utility approved a $3 per water meter surcharge for watershed restoration that will sunset in 5 years. It's raising 12.3 million. And you see all that. I'm not going to go through all the different things we're using it for. The state legislature, we lobbied hard to actually get money directly to our projects. And then FEMA is providing about 6 million in hazard mitigation funds. And then we have our congressional folks have provided funding, and Oregon Department of Forestry is providing, helping us with our fuels work. So total about $34 million is our budget between now and 2024. Now, the strategic action, I'm just going to go through real quick. This is kind of where we're leaning into next. Given the large scale of burned private property, we see an opportunity to potentially acquire large chunks of land and then restore them into carbon sequestration forests that we can then sell as a local marketplace. So we are in partnership with U of O. This is our carbon research forest that we started 2 years ago with U of O. And basically the idea is we bought this property because we have a substation that we're expanding. And so we bought this tax lot and turned it into a research forest. But the idea is that carbon is really stored, as you can see, in the soil, not in the plant matter. And when you look at this, we're obviously in the latitude about 45 degrees, or 45 degrees. So latitude. And so you can see there's a lot of potential for us to increase carbon storage in the soil if we get this right. And so the idea that we're working with is that you can have species diversity, which increases carbon accumulation, and you can have structural diversity that helps with water efficiency and decrease fire risk. But what we're looking at is getting that sweet spot where you do both on the landscape to not only increase carbon, but in these depositional environments, you're basically locking that carbon in the soil. And that is it for me. So thank you for that. And I will stop sharing.
That's great. Thank you so much, Karl. I have lots of questions, but I'm going to wait. I'm going to pass it over to Paula.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm Paula Stepp, as introduced, and I'm the executive director for the Middle Colorado Watershed, but I am also on Glenwood Springs City Council. So some of the things that happened in our watershed directly influenced our city as well. And so I'll be addressing that as I speak to this presentation I'm giving you. So as you can see, we've been directly impacted by a few major events in all of your backyard. I'm sure you're well aware of some of the things that we've experienced, as we are well aware of what other counties and communities are experiencing. The Middle Colorado Watershed Council was started in 2009 with a number of stakeholders that came together and said we had to protect the watershed that runs between Glenwood Canyon and the town of Beck. In 2013, it was formalized as a nonprofit, and we work with various stakeholders. And our mission is to both evaluate, also to enhance and protect the water quality in this watershed. So we are looking at all our stakeholders, whether they're agricultural, municipal, the natural resource agencies. All of us kind of work together to collaborate to see how we can take care of this watershed. In 2018, working kind of under the state water plan, we started developing a stream management plan that pulled in all of those different stakeholders that I just mentioned. And we called ours an integrated stream management plan because we took half of the stream management planning under the guidance of the Middle Colorado Watershed, and the other half was under Gar Pit conservation districts. And we divided up and tried to figure out with a number of stakeholders how we could put together a plan to look at the next 20, 30 years of taking care of this watershed. And that plan, which took about 35 meetings with 2,500 volunteer hours with all of our different stakeholders, came up with a way to meld agriculture, recreation, industrial, municipal, and natural resource needs into a planning process. And part of that was dealing with things that we were already seeing in the area, which was drought and with fire. And this is one of the 55 tasks that were identified. And again, you can kind of see as speaking to all the things that has been talked about this morning, is it's a collaborative effort. We work together to figure out solutions. Our area is no stranger to fire, as you can see. We are in a drought era, I guess, of at least 20 years of drought experience. And that kind of exacerbates what we have to deal with as far as fire quickly taking hold and impacting our area. When we were finishing up our IWMP, we had two major fires hit our area. We had the Grizzly Creek fire happening in Glenwood Canyon, and then we had the Pine Gulch fire happening on the west side of the county into Mesa County. So most of our watershed is in Garfield County, but we're also overlapping into Mesa County. what happened when we had this fire hit in Glenwood Canyon is and this is kind of coming into my role as the Glenwood Springs City Council, one of the immediately impacted area, the Grizzly Creek fire, was in Grizzly Creek drainage and the no-name drainage. And that meant that we had to quickly react to what was our water source for the town of Glenwood Springs. The Public Works Department quickly went to work and started protecting the intakes, and construction work began while the fire was burning. It included things like stream dredging at the intakes, metal plating on and above the intake, stream bank armoring, pipe stabilization, and structure protection. Again, a collaborative effort working with our local businesses, looking to resources wherever we could for people to contribute and help out in this situation. At the same time that we were working on the water intake, we had a mass influx of wildland firefighters who took advantage of our 3 airports in the region to fight the Grizzly Creek fire. Unfortunately, a fire in a canyon means most of that fire is climbing up canyon walls, very difficult to take care of and to battle effectively. Even saying that though, they were pretty amazing. And even though it took us a couple weeks of shutting down the canyon and really getting to work, things were brought at least into the point where we could open back up our canyon after the interstate and the canyon after a couple of weeks of burning in the fire. The damage to the interstate facilities was being monitored daily by CDOT. And that was to ensure structural soundness so that we could continue that firefighting. But the damage to the interstate itself from direct fire exposure and rockfall was pretty low. So we were pretty lucky in that realm, at least for that year in 2020. These next 2 slides are going to show the bear reports that show the potential for debris flow and post-fire impacts that were supplied by USGS through the Forest Service. Having 2 fires in 1 watershed was only the beginning. We'd need to accommodate what would be coming next. As you can see from this one, this is from the Grizzly Creek fire. We are looking at some heavily impacted areas. The deeper reds and purples are the high intensity burn areas. The yellow and lighter colors are the more moderate burn areas. But where those high intensity burn areas are the drainages that fall right into our interstate, which impacts all of us in the Western Slope because of its use as a travel corridor. This is the Pine Gulch burn, the bear report, showing the burn scar and the debris flow mapping that was expected from there. In this one, what we were looking at is not only debris coming through to the DeBeck area, debris flows and possible flooding, but it would also impact heavily Mesa County and what could even go to the town of Fruita as far as some flooding and impacts. So those are things that were being considered at that time. While these fires were burning in our area, 2 other fires started in Colorado. We had the Cameron Peak starting on August 13th, and that would turn into the largest fire in Colorado. And the East Troublesome fire started October 14th, and that was one of the most destructive fires. These new fires started to draw the state's attention also. And in the long run, this kind of addresses what somebody had asked earlier. That would mean a division of resources for helping to not only fight these fires, but also for the post-fire impacts that we would see in the next year or 2. So when you're looking at the potential for impact for the fires, you've got to also understand the risk to our water quantity and our water quality. That's essential to the managers facing decisions regarding the water supply protection. You're also tracking the changes in river condition so that we'll be able to alert downstream users. And we saw this immediately with the fire burning in the Grizzly Creek. And then we continue to experience that in the years after that fire in 2020. Glenwood Springs public water infrastructure relied on that water from No Name and Grizzly Creek. So with help from local, state, and federal partners, Glenwood has been able to pour 3.4 million into updating their water intake system and the water plant to supply the water to over 10,000 people that are supported through Glenwood's water system. The Red Mountain water plant upgrades included adding plate settlers, filter media upgrades, improved chemical pretreatment, and improving solids removal capabilities. This is really important when you look at sediment hitting the water in the years after a fire is hit. We have our intake at the No Name Tunnel, and that had project work to protect the water delivery and improve the plant's performance. And the last time that work had been done, I think, was in 1976. So we had a big gap there of having to update a lot of things. The city also will now have a better access to a redundant water supply. Our water supply primarily comes off No Name and Grizzly Creek, but we also have some water rights off the Roaring Fork. So now we're pulling water off of there into the future so that we can mix that water and have a good consistent supply of water, not only for these kind of situations with a fire, but also with the situations that we may be dealing with the drought. For CDOT, they used Flow 2D modeling to model potential debris and the events before and after mitigation measures were installed. Several proposed mitigation measures were screened out because they thought they would be ineffective. But 2 emergency construction contracts were issued, one to repair the damage due to the fire and one to construct some mitigation measures. So I think when I was talking to Andrew Knapp from CDOT at one time, he said in that year between the fire in August 2020 and pre-runoff, the CDOT spent $4 million on the mitigation efforts, preparing for what could come next. For the Middle Colorado Watershed Council, we sat down with the Colorado River District and said, what do we need to know? And what are those impacts going to be to not only the town of Glenwood in that immediate area, but those downstream communities? And the 2 things that came up were water quality. How is that going to change with what might happen in the years after the fire? And then also, how do we predict what's happening in each of those drainages in the canyon? So in the winter of 2021, we were able to get funding to at least start tracking, to put the pieces in place to start sampling water in the canyon using resources from USGS and funding from the Colorado River District's partnership funds. So we set up some water quality monitoring, additional stations on top of what USGS already had. We started planning for some synoptic sampling, which would be sampling by hand to give us a baseline. And so when events happened, either through runoff or through a monsoon event. We also, at that point in time, when some additional funding came through the state with fire restoration funding in the spring, we went back and said, what else do we need? Well, we need to know what the weather is. And as I mentioned earlier, every drainage in that canyon might have a different weather event. So we were able to get funding together with support from local stakeholders, including our county, Garfield County, and other entities to say, let's get these rain gauges in place. And we were able to place 7 of them in the canyon. CDOT was able to place another 2 of them, and those were all put in place before the monsoon started last summer. And this was a coordinated effort between CDOT and the National Weather Service here down in Grand Junction, so that the rain events would be noted. That information would get sent electronically to the National Weather Service. The National Weather Service would be able to quickly respond, get back to CDOT. CDOT could use their warning system to know when to shut down the canyon. I have to say that collaborative efforts were already starting as this was going on, trying to figure out how, when, where to put in rain gauges. We ended up talking to Eagle County, who responded to the Lake Christine fire a couple of years earlier. How did they do that? What did they set up? What were their resources? The other things we talked about was soil moisture with the Boulder Watershed Collective. What kind of monitoring were they doing now? How was that impacting water knowing what the water content is in the soil and how to use that to predict possible rain event impacts into our area. We also started working with a company that set up a simplified dashboard so that our downstream communities will be able to quickly see changes in water quality, and we're working on setting that up this year. So then you get after the fire. So as any of you have had fires in your watershed, probably the first thing you see is visits from people who have already been impacted by a fire. We were lucky to pull in some people who have dealt with fires for the last 20 years here in Colorado and bring their experience to us so that we could then turn around and quickly take care of things. Working with NRCS and FEMA, who came in and helped not only Glenwood Springs, but helped the county in setting up some mitigation efforts in the Glenwood Canyon. So what we saw, though, is it happened exactly as they said it would happen. You have a fire, and then after that, you're going to have some flooding and you're going to have some debris flows. So when we looked at the summer of 2021, luckily at that point, we had our water quality set up. And in June, we got those rain gauges set up. At the end of June, we started to see the impacts of storms coming into the canyon and into the area. The active monsoon season caused a lot of debris flows throughout the canyon in 2021. Prior to July 29th, the damage was minimal. And it was mostly cleanup efforts that came in. And I say minimal, and that was from the perspective of CDOT. They were able to get in quickly, clean up the roads, get the canyon back opened again. On July 29th, the first major damage was caused due to debris flows. And on July 31st, as maintenance crews were cleaning up and preparing for reopening, another flash flood warning was issued, and the canyon crew evacuated the canyon. A 500-year storm event brought rain in sheets and in waves. One rain gauge measured 1.5 inches of rain in a 15-minute period. So the water tore through the highway infrastructure. The canyon completely closed again, impacting the town of Glenwood for another couple of weeks. As we started, first we had to recover from COVID on the economic impact. Then we have a fire in the canyon in 2020. And then again, the canyon closes in 2021 due to these debris flows. When the first debris event occurred at No Name in June of 2021, and this is where I'm going to backtrack a little bit on low impact. When that happened, the sediment content was so high that the system shut down. And what happened, instead of the intake shutting down, is it remained opened. So it was set for a 500 NTU limit. So normally those creeks were running at 2 to 6 NTU, and that's the kind of water quality that we were using in our water intake. Set for 500, saying something bad's going to happen, that's at 500 NTU. What we saw instead was 4,000 NTU coming in through that No Name Creek and hitting our water system. Not only was Glenwood impacted by these changes in our water, though, our other downstream communities were also impacted, especially those that relied on the water from the Colorado River. And even now, the town of Silt is still trying to figure out how to mitigate what happened last year and what could potentially happen this year on the impacts that they've had on their water plant. And the impacts go all the way down to the town of Beck and further down, into the Mesa County area, as far as what that does to their water plants. It also impacts the agricultural community. It also impacts the agricultural community in the fact that you can't shut your head gates if you're in the middle of irrigation season. So instead, what you got to do is deal with additional sediment and silt onto your fields. So this is this was the July 29th damage that came from, the July 31st damage that came, and this was one of the major drainages that was hit. This is the Blue Gulch drainage hitting the highway. I do have skip that one. I do have this. I'm not sure. We do have I'm going to show a little bit of this video, and then I'm going to probably cut it short because it's 4 minutes. I don't want you to sit through it, but it shows, this is the CDOT coverage showing that immediate damage after July 31st and how that changed the Colorado riverbed there with the stuff that came down through Blue Gulch. And again, this is going to take you up the drainage a little bit. And I'm looking at my time, so I'm going to probably skip through this pretty quickly. The U.S. Forest Service did investigate these drainages afterwards, and I have something that I had to wrap my head around to get yesterday, having a conversation with the Forest Service. This kind of shows how this was gouged out as that water came through. We have parts of this this gully now that is 20 feet wide from where this water tore through the canyon and 15 feet high with sediment on either side. So I'm going to go ahead to the next one now. Stop it, maybe. There we go. Yesterday, I sat down with the Forest Service. We were talking about some of the funding they got for repairs for what's coming with restoration efforts. And that's the White River National Forest. I was talking to the district supervisor and a couple of the employees. And they spoke a little bit to some of the stuff that happened in the Blue Gulch drainage. And then they talked about that and related to the other drainages in the canyon and what they were impacted with these debris flows. And what they were saying is not only were we impacted by, we have burned, scarred land, and that's going to impact us as far as flooding and debris flows. But what we also have is 100 years of history of layers of dirt and debris that have been piling up in some of these drainages. And that was also, or that may have been the main component of what came down in that drain, the debris flows on that night of July 31st. So when I look at what that means for us in our communities, and when we talk about debris flow and flooding, we're not only impacted by what happens with the fire. These monsoons that come through and hit us also impact our watersheds. So it's another aspect we have to look at. That weekend of July 31st, we had damage in off of our Crystal River, which is up off of Highway 133. We had other places in the county that were impacted that had debris flows that weren't fire impacted. So those are things that we also have to look at, is what's on that ground and what's happening in those forests. Again, going back to what was talked about earlier, that we need to have some mitigation and awareness of when we're looking at these potential impacts on our summer monsoons. I had a couple of versions of this slideshow, so I just trying to catch up with my own slides here. This scouring, like I said earlier, cleaned out those drainages, and now what we're trying to look at this year is what is going to be the impact from monsoons coming in 2022. We're putting a lot of things in place to prepare for that, working collaboratively with different people throughout our watershed, from county, towns, the natural resource agencies, any group that we can bring in a collaborative effort to start looking at continued water quality monitoring and continuing monitoring with our rain gauges. CDOT is working in 22-hour shifts right now, trying to clear debris from the canyon from last year's debris flows. There were still 4 major piles to remove above the power plant in March, and that's part of that Blue Gulch area and some other drainages. Unfortunately, the Shoshone power plant plans to go offline for maintenance April 2nd. So where that water has been held back right now from running through between the dam and the Shoshone outlet, we're going to start seeing some water come through. So again, that's CDOT is working as quickly as possible to get what they can out of that area. But The other part is we have areas below that outage area that has sediment in the river. And so we're either working with UP if we can get them online to haul some of that out, or we'll also be pushing it over to the embankment side. So all of that sediment doesn't start impacting us. When I look at the future, there are additional costs that these disaster events have to be. Let me start over here. We have to figure out ways to work with our communities as we look at the future. We have to work collaboratively, as has been mentioned earlier, on what we need to do, not only before the fire happens, but after the fire happens, before the fire happens on pre-mitigation events, after the fire happens on restoration events. How do we work together to do these things? We are continuing to take care of some of the impacts that we had from that fire. We'll be doing that for the next 2 to 5 years. We'll also be sitting together to go, what are our priorities now moving forward? What can we do in advance? The Middle Colorado Watershed Council is working with a Roaring Fork pre-mitigation fire collaborative from everybody from the towns from Aspen down to Glenwood Springs, regionally, the counties, the fire districts, on what kind of what can we put in place now in our efforts to stop the next fire from happening, or at least reduce the impact from it. As a result of that, we're also starting collaborative effort, working with the Forest Service again and other stakeholders on what can we do on the Middle Colorado corridor between the Glenwood Springs and DeBeck Canyon, and how can we work with landowners and stakeholders there to do things on the pre-mitigation side. We did get some funding from CWCB to start working on that collaborative. So we are kind of looking in advance of what we can do to protect these this watershed and the area around Glenwood Springs. From this slide, you can see we do have a collaborative effort. Not only we were worried about who our downstream users are and having a communication network with them, but we've also pulled in all sorts of supporters and collaborators from the state, the federal, and local agencies to show that we can work together and we can make a difference on the impact that these disasters, whether they're debris flows or fire or whatever they are, if we can work together, then we're going to come together with a better plan that helps all of us in mitigating some of these impacts. And I think that's my time.
Thank you so much, Paula. Also, lots of questions. So I have a couple, but I think I might start actually with one and then kick it to the audience. But just as you were showing that last slide, and this kind of gets to all of our speakers' work. You know, obviously fire doesn't really care about county lines, and that's why you have these, you know, collaborative approaches. But I'm wondering, how do you get consensus on what you're going to plan for and how you're going to spend money and what some of those pre-mitigation things that you're planning on doing? And I guess this could be to all of our speakers, you know, it's obviously we're collaborating and working together, but how do you sort of navigate if there are differences of opinion on what to do and how to plan? And I'll kick it to Paula first, just since she's sitting here and I was just looking at her.
You know, for me, it's, I have to tell you, first of all, I started as the executive director of the Middle Colorado Watershed Council in December of 2020. Previous to that, I was on their board. So I had an idea of what was going on. Also, like I said, I was a city council member, so I knew kind of the background. And I also had some relationships that were already built. So I think you start with the relationships you have, and then you start with outreach, and you make phone calls, and you have meetings, and you just work together trying to explain what the problem is from your perspective, and then really trying to understand what the problem is from other perspectives. So when I look at this pre-mitigation effort right now, I'm going to look to not only to, a town or the county or a public agency, but it's going to be a lot of outreach to landowners. What does this mean for you? And it's really trying to understand what it means for each of those entities to then turn around and come back to find a common ground.
Great, thanks. I don't know if either of you, Chris or Carl, have any experience with that and thoughts.
Sure, I'll go ahead and jump in. I see Carl nodding as well. What a great question and what a great challenge. How do you get consensus, especially with something that is so moving and so impactful as the decisions we have before us? A couple of things that, because we're in that situation right now, there's more work than any of us can do. And there's by design, some dynamic tension, right? We all come to the table from a different perspective. We all have a different lens, and we all have different values and priorities that we're trying to find a path to. Part of it to me is we start with the common humanity. At the end of the day, there is no big machine that gets this all done. It's a collection of individuals and people, each with our own story. And so, who is it that's at the table? Who is it that is not at the table that needs to be? And so I think there's the piece around who needs to be part of the conversation. There's also the piece about how do we find that balance, because we can't just have an open-ended conversation about what should we do to solve the world problems. We need to have some framing in there. And so how do we create a box to have the conversation in that has sideboards that are that we can all work within and allow for the discussion, but don't prevent us from and still keep us moving forward, but don't prevent us from throwing new ideas in there. And so a couple of things we're doing is just asking a little bit of open-ended stuff. What are the values that matter to you? What do you want to see happen? And from there, we're at least for our recovery, we're going to start refining that purpose and need. We're all anchored in a common purpose and need around recovery. How do we translate that into to use the NEPA equivalent, what's the proposed action? But let's take it a little step at a time, and let's not try to solve all of it right at once, and just go through it, little steps, one piece at a time. So that's what we've been doing.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I think you already heard some really good answers to that. From my perspective, kind of where we started was kind of the high priority for us as a drinking water utility was emergency response, spill response, and doing things that basically really it's hard for someone to say, no, that's not important, or I don't care about that. And so it's that idea of going slow to go fast, where I personally spent months meeting with 33 different agencies and organizations that may be involved or impacted by a hazardous material spill on the highway, and sat down with each of them to figure out, well, what can you bring to this? What are your gaps? What would you like to have? Do you have any data that would help? And from that, we actually built a watershed emergency response system. And so that we drill on every year as interagency team. And so that started building relationships around something that everybody could get behind with the Forest Service and, county and ODOT and, all these other players. And then we moved into an area that was kind of like, well, where's the nexus that we could all kind of agree we should be working together on? And that turned out to be from the recreation economic side, the water quality side, the fish side, was really around floodplains and riparian areas. And so then that's kind of naturally that collaborative that we developed for the emergency response, then the same players are also playing in this larger view of watershed protection restoration that really focused on riparian and floodplain areas that led to the Pure Water Partners program, and then kind of memorializing some of these collaboratives. So it's it's kind of the go slow to go fast approach, really.
That's great. Thank you. And I like how, how you're explaining how it sort of builds on itself too, which makes sense. All right, any audience questions?
Thank you guys very much for your presentations, because it's so important for us to hear what you've already been through, because the Western Slope, as you're hearing from us and you heard from Paula, we just started to get these huge fires on the Western Slope. And so why we are pivoting, maybe after this, we realize how important it is. But you're going to hear now from people about identifying the risk. We heard from Jamie up front from the wildfire people. We're going to be competing for money. We've got people on the Front Range that have already been here. We've got Colorado Springs Utilities sitting right in front of me. We have Aurora Water in the front table. A lot of our collaboratives have already been working. But one of the new focuses for us is CWPPs, our Community Wildfire Protection Plans. Did you have some in place before these events? Would it have helped you to have it in place before the events? The other thing that we found, I've learned from the Front Range people, learned from Cindy Dozier up on Hinsdale County, is a lot of the wildfire decision support systems never identified those critical areas that need to be protected when you know a fire is coming. They need to have them on a map so they know where those most critical acres are. Frank Mem talked about that 20% of the acres can help. It's all over the West, but focusing on the 20% of those acres is so key for being before the fire. And how do you get there? So I'm hoping we learn more from our CWPP speakers this afternoon, but what was your experiences? Did you have your wildfire support systems identifying areas so you could maybe do more fire protection before the fire hit? And did you have CWPPs, Community Wildfire Protection Plans, going into your events in your area?
I'll take a shot at a couple of those. Excuse me. So as far as the preseason planning and our plans ahead of time, at least in California, we have CAL FIRE as a partner. And so here on the Plumas, we have a lot of areas that are what's called SRA, state responsibility area, meaning they're private lands. However, we have a portion of our protection responsibilities. So those lands fall under the responsibility of the federal agency, in this case, the Forest Service, to provide initial attack, even though they are private lands. And so that coordination happens every year. And so as far as identifying the critical values and the resources at risk, that's something that we do every year. Our WFDIS decisions in something when we're seeing a almost a million acre fire like the Dixie, where we're seeing massive fire growth every day, it is a challenge to keep up. WFDIS decisions, as wildland fire decision support system decisions, the tool that we use to kind of document where those resources are, sometimes doesn't really keep up. Or it takes us a while to redraw the box to keep pace with the fire. That said, there are a number of other tools that we do use. One of the first things we did, and we have a lot of, for example, tribal, very important tribal areas within our fire footprints. And so one of the things we did is ordered up a tribal liaison, so we could really make sure we're coordinating ahead of time and identifying those. We ordered the resource advisors in, and we had some great support from a lot of the resource advisors and specialists. Because WFDIS is going to have what's in our forest plan. It's going to have those known resource values, but there's a lot of stuff that we don't always know the details of. And so having the capacity to try to get out there ahead of time and embed that with the incident management team, so that we're looking at what those values are as we're laying out plans. And we have some large avoidance areas. We have some known avoidance areas, the usual stuff, right? Retardant in the waterways, that kind of stuff that pops up. The more complex challenges are around those things that aren't known. For example, we had a marijuana site with some potential chemicals in it that no one really knew about. And so how do we integrate those multiple communication systems ahead of time, is something we continue to ask ourselves. How do we tie into our local partners, the sheriff's office, our state partners, to the data they have that we may not? And so, long answer to kind of summarize, there are tools, we did use them, we can always use more, but in the end, it's really more about the communication and engaging the right partners to get that information when you need it, and not relying purely on what's in the decision support systems. Thank you.
Yeah, I think Chris hit it pretty well, the nail on the head. I would just add that for us ahead of time, well, we have a couple things. One is we have this what's called these Forest Protection Associations. So EWEB is part of it. I'm actually on the board of it, where private timber and Forest Service and BLM basically work together around fire prevention and response. And so every year we do drills and we do field tours of where problem areas are. And so as Chris mentioned, you kind of build those relationships ahead of time, because that's what it's all about during a disaster, is actually knowing who to call and having open communication and having the trust to work together. And so I think, and the other piece of that was working with the Forest Service to do stewardship contracting that allowed us to do thinnings. And then those funds stayed in the watershed to do other restoration work. So it not only helped thin some areas, but then provided funding for other work. And then I think the third piece that really is important is we did collectively in the county hazard mitigation planning, not only for fires, but for floods and earthquakes and other things, and are now putting the infrastructure in place for early warning systems around, cameras that alert for fire, flooding. We have early warning systems for water quality, and we're continuing to kind of push in that direction to have early warning of things that may come at us and being able to respond collectively.
I think the only thing I wanted to add to that, just from our perspective on the Western Slope and all of Colorado, is the Department of Natural Resources, Colorado Conservation, let me do this right, Colorado Water Conservation Board, CWCB, is actually working on a plan this year for pre-mitigation efforts before the fire comes, and the collaborative efforts that that I was talking to earlier is working in partnership with them on what do we need to do and what are we looking at. And one of the first things that they've suggested, and I'm doing getting a lot of hand holding here, which is great, but they're saying, do some GIS mapping, figure out where the high risks are, and start working from that angle as you bring your collaborators together. So I think the state of Colorado, like I said, through the Department of Natural Resources, is also thinking this way on what do we do before we are impacted by a fire.
And if I could just, sorry to add on, but one of these things that I think Karl mentioned, it's important to have some perspective, I think, around this. We can lay out all of our resources in every system. We can have perfect fidelity on that information. But when we face massive fire growth that is highly resistant to control, we default to life and property, and so it's important as we look at how we might respond to recognize that what we have available for resources to fight the fire and the strategies that can be employed, we may not have a lot of discretion to even entertain protection of some of those resource areas because either it's impractical or the fire is just not going to allow it. And so I think framing those expectations, we don't want to be talking about protection of resources when we're fighting the fire. We want to be talking about taking steps to protect those resources long before there. So thanks.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think we have time for one more question, and we've got our mics floating around.
Thank you for so much for being here today and sharing so much really good information. I'm Cindy Dozier. I sit on the executive committee of Club 20 as well as Colorado Forest Water Alliance and the steering committee of Rocky Mountain Restoration Initiatives representing communities. And all of the information was very good. Something that Chris said that really struck me was the term WUI versus the term threats to communities. And I think that this is an important component that we define our language a little bit differently. And I'm wondering how you think we can shift, because honestly, WUI is so common now, and it has a very narrow interpretation rather than decreased threats to communities, which would include their water systems, their power systems, and so many other things.
So, yeah, and what sparked that is after this past season, you know, we are committed. We're going to do everything possible to not be in this situation again around our unburned communities, to not have our firefighters have to deal with some of the stuff they had to deal with. And the only way to do that is to take meaningful, substantial, tangible action quickly to reduce the risk to our unburned communities. And so how far, you know, look at the fire behavior we're seeing. How far out do we need to be looking? How do we start gridding out or aligning or revisiting what we thought were effective suppression potential lines, right? Or fuel treatments. And we did have some fuel treatments that were extremely successful at protecting and saving communities. But how do we recalibrate and get away from this concept that we just need to treat around the houses and start looking at how do we create areas we can, for example, burn defensively as the fire is approaching, you know, in a way that's really going to slow, you know, running crown fire in this case. And so I think it's really just recalibrating. And I like your concept of let's get away from just looking at the acronyms and start looking at anchoring to what is going to reduce the risk. And it's a partnership. We can't reduce the risk within communities. That's a part that, you know, the counties and the communities need to play, have a huge role in this, and it is a cross line, you know, situation. But from a land management perspective, we can absolutely be looking at how do we put our little piece in there to slow down fire.
Yeah, and I just to add to that, I think you know, we're viewing it from a landscape view, not necessarily a community. Well, it obviously includes protecting downstream communities, but getting away from the WUI idea altogether. And after a disaster like what we've gone through and what all of you have experienced, there's an opportunity, a window of opportunity to really look at doing things, building back better and doing things better. And so it's really, and I think that's the strength of a collaborative, is that it allows you to pivot and be able to take action during that window when you know you have opportunity and social support and license to do things that you couldn't do before, and really taking that and running with it. And so I think, you know, like we're undergrounding our, you know, we're a water and electric utility. We also, our generation, we have hydroelectric projects in the Mackenzie as well as elsewhere in the US, actually, wind farms and so forth. And so it's doing the funding now to start undergrounding those areas that we like, wow, you know, when we're replacing all of our thousands of poles that got burned, is starting to look at how can we build this back better, why we have the opportunity to do it is, you know, that's one lesson, I guess.
All right. Well, I think that is a great place to stop. And we just really appreciate all three speakers coming from all the different places and perspectives, and really appreciate those of you, Karl and Chris, for joining us from outside of Colorado to give that perspective, and for joining us today. So thank you so much.
Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you. Appreciate it.